We have now come to our last run-on sentence, and this one takes the cake. This is one run-on sentence in the source language, and after the translation process, we have come up with 4 complete sentences. You'll also notice that we tried to divide with 3 places where we have bold print, and with this we indicate the end of the sentence here that we're finishing and the beginning of the next sentence that we're going to start. Now, we look at our first sentence here and we start with la pérdida fiscal que se muestra en el anexo 1, the tax loss shown in Exhibit 1. And you'll notice that it ends here. The subject ends there in Spanish with a comma. We don't need that comma in English, so we eliminate it. We come to our verb, obedece principalmente a. Obedece a is due to primarily, and the rest of the sentence all the way down to compañía, due primarily to the operating loss of the company. Now you notice here in the source language, between compañía and entendemos, there is no punctuation of any kind at all. Since we have decided to stop right here and start our next sentence, we look at the next part, entendemos, and the word following is derivado, which gives me very little to work with for the translation process. So entendemos it is our understanding, and derivado, this past participle verb form, has to be, converted from this past participle form into an active voice verb with its subject. It is our understanding that it arises from our own operations and market conditions. Notice that in the source language, that part ends with a semicolon, and we end it simply with a simple comma. And we continue, as well as the effect of así como el efecto de las principales partidas fiscales. Partida is item. So we're talking about the effect of the main tax, accrual, and deduction items. Notice that here we have, in English, among other things, between 2 parentheses, and that came in last before our semicolon in the source language. All I did was move it up, because what we have after here is los cuales son, which I placed here right before the semicolon, which for me gives me a smoother entry into all of this that we have left, divided into 3 parts. We start with the annual adjustment on cumulative inflation, and again, they have a semicolon in Spanish. We only use a simple comma in English. Notice that mismo is translated as which is cumulative, due primarily to debts, deudas relativas, relative to the loans that the company has. Notice that at the end here, Spanish has a comma. In this type of situations, we use a semicolon in English. And we continue. Anticipos de clientes recibidos al cierre del ejercicio, advances from customers received at tax year end. And then we have parentheses. We open our parentheses here, and we're not going to close them until we get all the way down here. So take note. And we continue. And here it says, it is important to note on this accrual. What I did here was, sobre esta acumulación, I placed this after, es importante señalar. It is important to note on this accrual, and then we continue that. We come to la resolución miscelánea fiscal, which means, which we talk about, annual temporary tax regulations, which are issued every year in Mexico. We continue with our annual temporary tax regulations. Notice that in Spanish it says misma que, and that to me has no meaning if we try to translate, so we eliminate it. We continue with annual temporary tax regulations. We have our verb establece, set forth, and then we have a direct object, rules, reglas, no problem for translation. And we continue for compliance with tax provisions. And you'll notice the conjunction E comes after a comma in the source language, and in English, the comma comes after the conjunction. Well, no big problem. And it says, y en algunos casos, otros casos, in some other cases, we end here with a comma. There is no comma in Spanish. And we continue with que establecen opciones. Rules that set forth options. And with options, we end this second sentence. Here, as you can see, we do have a comma between opciones and para. We continue here with our next sentence, which says, para el caso de la acumulación de los anticipos. We have para el caso de, with regard to. We can also translate this as in reference to, or simply as to. We continue with regard to the accrual of advances, and then in Spanish we come to la referida miscelánea. Now, notice that miscelánea is all by itself, and the expression has three words. Resolución miscelánea fiscal. I cannot reduce that in any way in the translation process. I have to have the full expression, the annual temporary tax regulations. Also notice that it says referida, and I translated that as those, giving us a sense of distance with what came before. So, with regard to the accrual of advances, those annual temporary tax regulations set forth, we have establece, and then it says como opción, la incorporación de, and all of this is going to be my direct object, all the way down to anticipos. So I'm going to skip over como opción. So it sets forth the incorporation of an estimated cost for those advances as an option. So we go back and pick up como opción as an option. And then in Spanish it has es decir, with no punctuation. We translate that as that is, and we put in the punctuation, a comma before and a comma afterwards. And we continue. Es una deducción y solo reflejar en el efecto fiscal la diferencia. I'm going to jump over to la diferencia entre el ingreso y el costo and pick that up. But before I do that, I think that the verb reflejar in the infinitive form gives me very little to work with for the translation process. So I decided to use the causative form for that verb. So we're going to have a deduction and only have the first part of the causative form, and then we pick up la diferencia entre el ingreso y el costo, have the difference between the cost, the income and the cost, pick up the verb reflejar in the past participle form to complete the causative form, en el efecto fiscal, in the tax effect. We come to the end of the third sentence, the third idea. In the source language, there is no punctuation at all between el costo and sin embargo. So we put our period here, tax effect, and we continue. However, in Spanish it says, esta opción, la compañía no la, it says ejercicio. I think that should be ejerció. That's a mistake there. Anyway, we have two possibilities. We can do this in the active voice and say the company did not exercise that option. Or we can not change the word order and do it in the passive voice and say this option was not exercised by the company. We continue with lo que hubiera significado, a past conditional form, and then we come to a noun, la obtención. La obtención de una pérdida fiscal mayor. Obtención is a noun, and I think it works better as a verb in English. We're also going to translate obtención for the verb incur. Losses are incurred in English, not obtained. So we continue with which would have meant, and then I need the word that, so I can take this periodo fiscal mayor as my subject of this last part. A higher tax loss would have been incurred. I use the past conditional form for the verb form of this converted noun. And we come to the end here of the parentheses. We finally close the parentheses and we move on. Now, in moving on, I'd like to take a look at how we closed the parentheses. Notice that in Spanish, in the source language, you have the end of the parentheses, you have the conjunction E followed by a comma. Now, in contrast, we closed our parentheses and we stopped right there with a semicolon. And then what comes afterwards is our conjunction and. I have the impression that by putting the comma after the conjunction in Spanish, the intention was to connect the conjunction with what came before. But in English, I believe that the having the conjunction come after our semicolon connects the conjunction with what comes next. Now, let's really move on. We have acumulación de ingresos facturado fiscalmente. That is just a phrase by itself. It doesn't really have any specific purpose. You'll notice, as we mentioned, punctuation here. If we look at the rest of what, all the way down to the end, you'll notice that we only have one comma right here. There is no more punctuation, and that is not good. So we will go filling in the necessary punctuation in the translation process. And we continue. Revenue accruals billed for tax purposes. We have our comma, but, pero, and you'll notice there's no punctuation. Pero que al cierre del ejercicio, that's a time expression. So we're going to move on. No se transmitió. We have a reflexive verb. So I have to continue looking for my subject. La obligación de la venta, right there. I carry that over, but the sale obligation, I come back and pick up my reflexive verb, carry it over as a passive voice. The sales obligation was not transferred. To who? To the customers. When? At tax year end. And then we come to a semicolon here. And in Spanish, it says, okay, por lo tanto, here's our comma in Spanish. Por lo tanto, no more punctuation. And then it says, no tiene reconocimiento del ingreso financieramente hablando. Okay, I have identified reconocimiento as a noun, which is going to work better as a verb in English. So in our translation process, we come up with, but their accrual is recognized. Revenues are not recognized financially. And then we continue. We have another comma, and then we have but. Pero si se reconoce su acumulación, we have another reflexive verb. And then I come to acumulación. That's going to be my subject. But their accrual, I pick up my verb in the reflexive form. It comes over in the passive voice, is recognized, and I pick up the rest with de conformidad con las disposiciones, in conformity with applicable tax provisions or tax legislation, and therefore, notice that in Spanish it has y por ende. When we have and then therefore, there is a comma in the middle, and comma therefore, and then we close therefore with another comma. And we go back to Spanish, se reconoce como deducción. I'm going to skip over that combination and come to el costo del vendido, the cost of sales of such revenues, or the cost of goods sold or cost of sales of such revenue. Pick up our reflexive verb, se reconoce, is recognized como deducción, as a deduction. And this is how we come to the very end of this mega-sized run-on sentence.